Hi everyone. So I'm moderating this panel just because tech reasons. My name is Kayla Webb. I'm the student director of the Freedom Project. And right now we have lovely Rose Miller, who currently is in California. So she is Skyping in to give her presentation. So take it away, Rose.
Lovely. Hello, guys. I can finally hear you. Exciting. Okay, so let's get started. So I chose to do labor and civil rights, and I've been interested in civil rights for a really long time, and I'm always kind of looking at different ways to understand it better. And there's been this intersection between labor and civil rights throughout the years. And as I was doing my research, I found that there was this perception that labor rights had actually impeded progress that was made by civil rights, and they had really different goals. And that there's evidence that that just isn't true, and I disagree with that statement personally. So I want to kind of talk about this interesting dichotomy between the two and figure out what their relationship actually was and how it is we can learn from that today. So I think I want to start off with saying that the two had many theoretical similarities. So they both believed that all people were equal and deserved the same treatment and opportunities in the social and financial sectors, and there needed to be some sort of regulation following that. And they also had this really strong emphasis on cultivating successful leaders. And so this was largely in training camps. And they had these massive training camps that trained these really prominent labor and civil rights leaders. And without these, and without those sharing of ideas, the movement simply wouldn't be the same. And also, they both came to the conclusion that social change was best facilitated by the involvement of the greatest number of people possible. We can see this in the civil rights movement with the March on Washington and all of the community organizing that happened, and with organized labor as well. The whole premise behind organized labor is that you involve the workers in determining what their own rights are. And so these grassroots models really helped both of them to flourish. And my favorite example of the intersection between these two is the life of Miles Horton, who was born in Tennessee in 1905, was a small town boy, and ended up attending Cumberland University, where he had his first experience to students of color, foreign students, and low-income students. He had had a pretty homogenous experience throughout most of his life, and so this was something completely out of his realm of ordinary. After that, he attended the Union Theological Seminary in New York, and he studied under the theologian and ethicist Reinhold Niebuhr, who still influences a lot of religious thought in America today. And Niebuhr told him that he should reform society into a, quote, social order based on the teachings of Jesus. And so he really brought this religious aspect to his organizing, both in labor and in civil rights. He then visited some settlement houses and ended up getting really involved and really interested in the labor movement. At the time, there were things going on both in the U.S. and internationally, and he was one of the main organizers of the International Ladies Garment Workers Strike. After he had some experience in labor for a couple of years, he decided he wanted to go and further his education. He went to U Chicago, and it was that he formed his views on social order and the improvement of conditions for workers, and he really believed that the workers needed to be involved in the process of determining their own fate and determining what their rights were in the workplace. So in 1932, he and some others formed the Highlanders School, which helped organize both unemployed and working people at first, but eventually served as an education center for the Congress of Industrial Relations in the region. And this school was where union organizers, labor leaders, and civil rights activists were all trained. And not only that, but this was a center where segregation in labor unions was battled against. And this was a place full of intellectual thought and learning, but also practical organizing experience and skills. And these people were being taught really how to organize and how to persuade people that their cause was right? And out of the Highlanders School came some of the most prominent leaders in civil rights as well as organized labor. And this is just one example in Horton's life of how civil rights and labor kind of form this seamless intersection between the goals of the two, and illustrates how easily they can actually come together and support each other, and how vital they both are for each other's existence. A quote from the AFL-CIO of modernity kind of stresses this. So, and I quote, "The civil rights movement and the labor movement have been intertwined from the beginning. Civil rights leaders have always been labor leaders too. America's union movement champions those who lack a voice in our society. Union members played a critical role in the civil rights struggles of the past, and that involvement continues today." So this rosy statement does belie actually a more fraught history. Historically, the civil rights movement worked for many years trying to root out employment discrimination. And this employment discrimination was actually propagated by labor unions, so this was a big point of struggle for the two. This kind of came to a fever pitch in 1964 with the Civil Rights Act of Lyndon Johnson, and this outlawed employment discrimination, which the civil rights movement was obviously very happy about. And unions at first were happy about it, but as time went on, it became increasingly clear that they did not support it, even though it added to equality in the workplace. But they really became disillusioned because there was this feeling that the law invalidated their process of determining seniority, which was based entirely on family ties instead of ability. And the leaders at the time were all white, and so that would continue to be propagated had their system of seniority remained intact. And they also felt that it tried to make the rights of the individual more important than the rights of the group. And labor was it was a very close-knit movement, and they identified it with each other a lot. So it felt like it was kind of trying to tear them apart. Evidently, the Civil Rights Act was passed, and this came to be. And despite the disagreements, both movements really worked together politically in trying to get Southern Black people registered to vote, and other things like that in the South. And they really both felt that this was the only way that they could see liberal legislation through Congress, and end this political power block in the Southern states that was mainly the conservative Southern Democrats. And then the strategy was maybe not as successful as they liked. The civil rights movement really flourished from it. Labor flourished from it initially. Eventually this ended up not working out very well for them, as lots of working class white people in the South moved from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party towards the end of the 60s. And there was just this really interesting tension between the two. So in the political realm, as I was just talking about, they were often allies supporting liberal legislation. And it was more than just trying to get people to vote. There were lots of pieces of common legislation, right? They're both working for equality that they both supported, they both lobbied for, and the leaders worked together. However, the two were often at odds with each other due to the aforementioned Employment Discrimination Act and some general disagreement about policy issues. And I think that this made both movements better, right? So it sharpened the goals of the civil rights movement and helped them actually work out these disagreements from inside the organization before saying that to the public. And it also made organized labor really reckon with what they thought to be inclusivity or lack thereof, depending on one's point of view. And lastly, my favorite example of organized labor and civil rights working together is, of course, the March on Washington, the full title of which is the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. So here you can see signs from the United Auto Workers, Chicago Teachers Union, the American Newspaper Guild, among others. And it was really the working of these two movements together that made such events as the March on Washington possible. It was labor and civil rights having a lot of the same goals and really working together and sharing those ideas. And they consequently changed society because of that. So while some time constraints have prevented me from offering a lot more examples of conflict and cooperation between the two movements, I think that despite their struggles, the civil rights movement of today and of the 60s and organized labor shared a vision and momentum that changed the United States irrevocably, both in legislation and also in social order. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Rose. And now we're
Lovely.
going to have Virginia.
Need to get my power jacket.
All right. I
We all
respect that.
need one of those.
Yep, you should be good to go.
Thank you. How do I full screen this?
That should go away as you start presenting.
There you go. Awesome. Hi there, I'm Virginia Faust. I am a junior and an English major, and I'm going to be speaking today. Actually, would you prefer I talk on the mic?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm going to be speaking today about Marital, a Renaissance writer, and the subtlety of Renaissance proto-feminism. So this is the only known photo of her. Not a photo, a drawing, depiction. So first, before we begin unpacking Marital and her incredible legacy, we should talk about what we do know. So here we go. Two types. So on the right, like your left, we have the demure, sexless maiden. This is far from the reality of Renaissance women. On your right, there's the other alternate version of Renaissance woman, which is this overtly sexy, temptress, sort of dangerous courtesan. So what were these women actually like, other than these caricatures, which remain in media today? Which is what I just asked. So before we get into that, we should talk about Marital. This is a model that redid the photo. Well, now it's a photo. And she's in costume. I just think it's super cool. There's been a total resurgence in interest in her work. And yeah, I think it's such a cool photo, bringing it to life. So who was Marital? Her name was actually Modesta Pozzo. Born in 1955, died at 37 in 92. Spent her entire life in Venice. Super big fan of Venetian culture. Frequently wrote about its beauty and its influence. She was raised in a convent after being orphaned, then by her grandparents, super religious upbringing. Her family was of the elite class, the cittadini originari. I'm not Italian, obviously, from my pronunciation, which weren't the super elite, but they were high ups in government, if that makes sense. She was self-educated, frequently asked to perform orations, just like myself, just kidding. And people widely considered her a prodigy, so that's where we sort of diverge. She was first published at age 26, and was married a year later, had 3 kids, 4 if you count the one that killed her. She died during childbirth. So Marital is her pen name, and it means modest well or moderate fountain, depending on the way you translate it. A fountain or a well is an outpouring, right? So she did have a lot of outpouring of ideas and passion. Modest and moderate are slightly different versions of the same idea. Women were expected to be modest, sort of like that photo I showed you earlier. And moderation was a super interesting idea because as the Renaissance preceded the Enlightenment, moderation, compromise, reason were ideals of the intellectual elites, or the philosophes of the Enlightenment. And while they're 2 different eras, there's definitely an emphasis on this in the Renaissance as well. And so in this pen name, she's sort of categorizing herself among these well-read men. She wrote between domestic duties, or so wrote her former guardian Giovanni Doglioni in the preface that he wrote. He was actually the one who published the work posthumously. Posthumously? I don't know how to pronounce that word, I've only ever read it. Okay, so these are the works that she published. We should talk about those. She wrote musicals. She was the second woman in Italy to write this form, chivalric romance. And she wrote 2 major religious poems within which women were central figures. So, loved Mary. So, her best piece, in my opinion, is The Worth of Women, or alternatively translated The Merits of Women. And the subtitle is literally, Wherein is Revealed Their Nobility and Their Superiority to Men. Hello, Wellesley. This is proto-feminist literature at its finest, before even Mary Wollstonecraft. Published in 1600 again, it was the last thing she ever wrote. She was literally writing on her deathbed. Again, it was published with a preface written by Doug Leone, so everything we know about her is through the lens of a man. Kind of ironic. The content is, it's these 7 women, and they are speaking about gender, they're speaking about the men in their lives and their failings. Tons of super complex references to antiquity, culture. She has an intense command of the language and literary devices. And while this is an excellent book, we should note that it was entirely focused around this elite class that she was a part of, and so we don't really get the perspectives of any common women. There were 7 in number, so I'm not going to go through their names, but Virginia, it's kind of funny, because I'm also young and unmarried. But the categories of these women seem to fall into 2 major sects, right? And this image is from a play that was done sort of an homage to the piece. So most importantly, I think, of course, is their marital status in the piece. Constantly discussing this. I should mention that a domessa is a young woman who chooses to forego marriage in pursuit of godliness. Sounds great, right? And then also important is their age. So she differentiates between age and sort of shows the progression of women's roles over time. So how was womanhood defined by marital status, if we're going to begin with that? Through the lens of Marital Fonte, of course. Virginia, the young unmarried woman, she's talking about well-mannered young men who politely do not stare at her. And she says, I could never believe that such a man would ever deceive me. And her role in the piece is sort of the young, hopeful, looking for love. And she's sort of met with a lot of derision from the older women and the married women, even the young married women. So removing that variable of age, there's a definite difference. Cornelia, the young married woman, again, also young but married, women who are married or martyred, more accurately, have endless sources of misery. So those of us who want to get married, we've got a lot to look forward to. They're shut up like animals within 4 walls and subjugated to a hateful guardian. That sounds terrible. And she sort of blames any female vice on men in when she finally says, I didn't highlight this, but she causes the downfall of countless women who would be better behaved if their husbands were more kind and loving. So the next time you act out, blame men. Leonora, the older widow, so new marital status perspective, says, for when a man has amorous concourse with a woman, the result is the greatest shame for her and a certain amount of credit and praise for him. This sounds so third way feminist. It is a very shameful thing when we stoop so far as to have anything to do with these inferior creatures. Sorry, guys. Especially outside the necessity of marriage, which, since it is imposed on us, we can hardly avoid. I think this is incredible. This woman was writing this, and this is the Renaissance, right? These are things that we talk about all the time with people like Amber Rose, right? And what was it, like the slut walk? Like this is awesome, in my opinion. The summary of this, I included stock photo to keep you interested. It's definitely a critique of marriage as an institution. Virginia's idealism, can't say I share it, but with the reality of anecdotal experiences, the women who are married or have been previously married show a lot of negativity, which, I mean, yeah. And also, I think it's important to note that all the husbands listed that they each have, or the types, they go over the types of husbands. They're categorized by their vices. So there's like a gambling conversation, and then infidelity conversation, and then like beating your wives conversation. So it's super varied, but definitely comprehensive. How is womanhood defined by age? Virginia, the young unmarried woman, says, but couldn't we come up with some kind of remedy to improve them a little? She says, if you have a ragged old dress, you can mend it so it passes as new. And unappetizing dishes can be improved by adding butter and spices. I love that. Leonora, the older widow, instantly replies, dear sister, I would not know where to start to try to disguise the taste of these rotten men. They are incapable of change. You know, the way she describes it is so poetic. They're mature trees. They're wine that has gone off. I love that. You can tell that Fonte has an extremely complex command of the language, and also it's interesting that this even made it to publication. The summary of these findings, again, a weird little document. It's a little patronizing the way the older women converse with the younger. There's definitely a futility of hope. She doesn't really suggest any, I mean, she does suggest solutions, but there's no hope for a future in which those solutions aren't necessary. And this mentorship implication of the young and the old speaking and conversation and dialogue suggests there's definitely an undercurrent of advice, and that was maybe a frequent relationship if we are to believe Fonte. And also it seems like the oppression of men, or the oppression of women by men, and sort of generational pain is cyclical, unending, or sort of hopeless again. So through the lens of the worth of women and the life of Marital Fonte and the work's publication, what can we discover about Renaissance women and proto-feminism? Remember, really the only big cornerstone piece published before this was Christine Pizan's the book of the City of Ladies, and following her a long time after was Mary Wollstonecraft's Vindication of the Rights of Women. There's no singular experience of women. We can't break it down into two dichotomies, and the same could be said for today. Fonte is arguing that marriage is a tool of oppression. You become increasingly disillusioned as you age. Even when your husband dies off, you're not going to be happy because of the amount of trauma he put you through, apparently. And not only are husbands discussed, they're probably the main category of men discussed. There's also fathers and brothers, and politicians and priests, and all sorts of different types of dudes discussed. And it seems as though the conversation is both an outlet for female frustration, but also it's encouraged and questioning, and these women frequently disagree, and it's sort of a beautiful tableau of thought, free thought and free speech. Yeah. So what can be said about Marital Fonte? Definitely a radical, an intellectual, constantly questioning her surroundings, feminist, I think, one of the first, experiencing frustration with the patriarchal systems that governed her life. Yeah, so I'm going to end on this quote. Do you really believe, Cornelia replied, that everything historians tell us about men or about women is actually true? You ought to consider the fact that these histories have been written by men who never tell the truth except by accident. I feel so alone. Wouldn't be the first time.
Hey Rose, can you put your camera back on?
I think it's Howard Jack. Not yet. Catch me in a
Okay, so I don't know why exactly Rose's video is off. It's off on her end. So, do we have any questions currently for? Oh, she's back.
Please be serious.
No, it just shows your name. All right, well, does anyone have a question for Virginia? Not the young and married woman. Wow,
Yes, come to you.
Yeah, so, is this on? Yes?
Yeah.
So my question has to do with like kind of the scope of feminism, and I know that like currently like one of the big critiques, especially from people who are like very anti-feminism, is that feminism is all about hating men.
Definitely.
And a lot of the sentiment that I've heard here is that, you know, obviously it's not about hating men, it's about, you know, wanting like an equal opportunity and chance for all women, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so it seems like a lot of the attitudes that are displayed in, I can't say her name because I don't remember it.
Marital Fonte.
Marital they're very like anti-men, like just like men suck.
Yeah.
And so I wonder how, like, what that says about like the origin of feminist movements, and if you have anything to speak about that.
I mean, I can answer as Virginia, or I can answer as a researcher. I don't know what you want, but I feel like there is some worth, for lack of a better word, to its origin. These women were not. She was self-educated. She didn't have, you know, the right to really study what she wanted, and the fact that she had to write between domestic duties, she couldn't. And even the fact that that's how she was remembered. The fact that a man wrote about her life and sort of praised her for writing between domestic duties, I think it indicates that the Renaissance, at least, was a time of incredible frustration for women in society, and at least in the elite class. And I think that as the world has gotten more equitable, I would make the claim that it's gotten more equitable over time, just from educational opportunities to occupational opportunities. I think feminism, again, it's gone through so many waves. I think it's progressed to be more about equality of the sexes, and even genders, if you're of that line of thought. And that's a good thing. But I don't think that we should sort of throw Fonte's work in the trash, if that makes sense, because it is indicative of what women experienced. And it's, I don't know that if Marital Fonte were a writer today, she would write similar frustrations.
Yeah.
So it strikes me, listening to your presentation about her, that there's a lot of misogyny inverted, that there was a big misogynist tradition about women, men writing about women in the Middle Ages and Renaissance that were a lot of the same, sort of similar kinds of complaints about women, and that part of maybe the fun of her writing and the game of it is that she's taking those traditions and turning them upside down.
Yeah.
And, you know, I also wonder, like carrying it forward into current feminism, if we don't, if that's not a dynamic that we still run into, that we only have certain ways of.
Can you hear me, Phila?
Yes, I can. I don't see you. You're calling from your phone, right?
Yeah, this I think is where we're at right now.
Alrighty, works for me if it works for you. Let's let Professor Lynch, she was currently asking a question, and then we'll open back up the floor to questions for you as well, okay?
Yeah, I just wonder what your thoughts are
Lovely.
about that topic.
I would agree. I think we can't take all of this as literal, because again, there are 7 different women. It's not just one woman writing a manifesto, right? So she has the courage, or sort of the intellectual breadth to entertain varying degrees of thought. And I think a lot of this is satirical, and it is meant to be funny and unexpected, especially when you think about contemporary writers. I mean, this isn't a great example, but the one thing that comes to mind is More's Utopia, right? When he writes about men and women, and in the utopian world, they would both, before marriage, take their clothes off and make sure they liked each other first. I think that tradition of satirizing men, the male gaze, in order to make a commentary is continued, and I think it's great. Like, I love SNL. And yeah, there are tons of, you know, recent contemporary literature and poetry all in that realm. It makes me excited.
So 2 questions related to each other. First of all, okay, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Sorry. So first of all, underlying a lot of her criticisms of the institution of marriage in particular is sort of this lack of autonomy argument, and the idea that women lack autonomy in what they're forced to do in their roles, and that's necessarily bad. So I guess the opposite of that must be true, is that any kind of way in which to maximize female autonomy must be good. So I guess bringing it, you can disagree with me there, but like, anyway, to bring it to like what my actual question was, kind of related to that, is like, I know there's a lot of debate going on, especially right now, about like whether choice feminism, like anything that a woman believes to be empowering she should be allowed to do, should be preferable to like a kind of, even if this isn't something that you necessarily want to do, this is what you should do in order to take down these big patriarchal systems. Like, which one of those do you think, one, we should prefer, or 2, she would prefer? And I guess also on that, do you think it's possible to engage in the institution of marriage without fueling patriarchy?
Okay, so first question first, before I forget it. I don't have a good memory. Would Moderata Fonte be a fan of female autonomy in all forms, is what you're asking. I think yes, precisely because she entertains 7 different women, and again, we really need to remember that it's only the elite women, so we have no idea really how she feels about the common woman or like queens. But in regards to these women, I think she doesn't paint any of them really as the antagonist, which is something that I think we can learn from. Even, you know, Virginia, the one that was like, I like men. They were, they were supportive of her, but they respectfully disagreed. Sort of, they were essentially the Freedom Project. And in my opinion, I do think we should allow women to make their own choices. I love my WCR friends. I think they're great, and I think they're smart. And I think we need to stop. I don't think we should give necessarily preferential treatment to women, but we should acknowledge how much harder it is to get to the same level, and enable women to make choices, even if those choices are in contradiction to sort of the feminist goal. I think it's important to allow those women to make choices, because that is inherently the goal. And then the second question was?
Do you think it's possible to?
Oh, marriage. Yeah, I think it is, because we're redefining marriage. We also need to remember that like women can marry women now too. So I think the institution of marriage is very different than it was in the Renaissance, when it was more of like a economic or social mobility situation. I think now there are varying reasons why 2 people might get married. And so I think in today's world, at least in my experience, I think it's great.
Okay, just one more double check. Sorry about that. Rose, can you hear us? I'm gonna go with no. Okay.
Can you type? Like, can you type to her?
Yeah, I can. It is a darn shame that it was working at lunch.
Hello.
Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
Here. I'll just type the questions. Does anyone have a question for Rose? Or for Virginia? Both are good questions.
Oh.
always raise my hand and then get scared because like my question isn't really formed or good. But I was curious, so you talked about the intersection, this is for Rose, talked about the intersection between the labor movement and the, I'm sorry, you don't have to read all of this, but, well, I'm sorry, this is confusing now. Okay, my main question, okay. I'm curious though about, it was mentioned briefly, but about the intersection between religion, particularly Christianity and churches, and the labor and the civil rights movement, because that seems to be something that you touched upon a little bit, and I know, yeah, sorry, this is, she can't hear me, this is embarrassing, but yeah, essentially, I don't know, that's the question.
Expand on that?
Oh, okay.
No, I'm saying, do you want me to ask her to expand?
Yeah. Is that something she, and what, how to explain that?
And you guys can hear me?
Yes.
Okay, yeah, so that's super, super important. I'm actually taking a religion class right now, and I might be majoring in it, so I think that that is like a huge part of the civil rights movement, but actually also labor, and I think that, right, Dr. King was a reverend, and like, civil rights and religion really went hand in hand, and they used religious doctrine to justify what they were doing. And it was really the same thing with labor. With Miles Horton, he studied at Union Theological Seminary under a whole bunch of influential theologians, but also other labor leaders as well brought religion to it. And I think that it's a really good way of kind of rallying people because particularly Christianity in America, most people at the time were Christian.
Kayla, in the meantime, can we field?
Yeah, are there any more questions
Any
for
more
Virginia
questions
while
for
we set
Virginia?
this up?
While we work on technical issues? Yeah.
I'm sorry, because I just asked the question.
No.
Okay, I'm just curious, like, why, this seems like a really interesting and revolutionary text, and I'm just curious why, like, why I've heard about Mary Wollstonecraft, and even Christine de Pizan, am I saying that right? Whatever. I learned about that maybe in like world history in like 10th grade or something, vaguely, but I never remember hearing about her. And I'm curious if, I know Wollstonecraft had a kind of sensationalized like life and biography, but I didn't hear much about Marital. And I think that maybe Wollstonecraft's like sensationalized biography and her daughter and all the drama. I wonder if that, I'm just curious if maybe that added to her fame and is the reason, it seems sometimes like the reason we read her is more for that than the actual text itself. But that was just a conjecture. I was just wondering why she's not, or I know there's a resurgence, but why she's not in the canon right now.
Yeah, it is, I think in part it's that, but then if you think of, Shelley, who died at like, 21? I mean, he's remembered, and he didn't really have sensationalized. Okay, he did like, yeah, okay. Well, that's he was the first example that I could think of. She died young, right?
Yeah.
At 27, so I don't know if she really got the chance to, I know this text wasn't circulated.
Okay.
Really, there's very few copies, even online, there's very few sort of like sources, and there are very few scholars who have even looked into it. She was sort of rediscovered in the 1980s for reasons still unknown to me. I tried to do digging, but it's not available. Yeah.
Okay, no, that's totally helpful, yeah. I was also going to ask about the reception of her work, but if it wasn't...
Yeah, there wasn't, there wasn't, right?
Yeah,
like,
that's probably why Wilson
she was forgotten, and that really bothers me. That's why I want to share it, because it's cool.
Awesome.
Yeah. Thank you.
I have another question for Virginia.
Go
I don't
for
need
it.
a microphone.
Okay.
I'm just curious, where did this even come from? Why did you choose her? What is the personal reason for this topic, or how did you even find her?
Simon Grody and Sarah Wall Randall, and their course, The Renaissance, which was a history English cross-listed course. There was a week where we read a chapter And they invited a scholar who knew a lot about her to give a presentation.
Cool.
Yeah.
I didn't know that. Okay. I think here's my concern. Can you hear us? Okay, she can hear us. We just can't hear her. It seems that something about the mic on her end is not connecting. Hello? Okay, I'm gonna try and plug you into the main thing, but we can hear what you're saying. Virginia has a question for you.
Sorry, what?
Virginia has a question for you.
Okay.
Okay, Virginia, what's your question?
So in regards to the like conversation between civil rights and labor activism, where do you see that? How do you see that increasing in complexity with the introduction of technology and social media movements and activism in terms of the modern world?
Did you hear that?
Complexity technology with labor and civil rights, is that the essence of it?
Yes.
Yeah?
Yes.
Yeah, that's it.
Okay, lovely. Yeah, it's getting increasingly complex. So the thing about labor and civil rights is that it's changed a lot since the 60s. The political landscape has changed, right? Like the block of conservative Democrats in the House no longer exists. And parties are more polarized, right? And stuff like that, right? And so, like, organizing has had to change. And I think that, like, as a product of, I kind of touched on this a little bit, but, like, as the Civil Rights Act and of unions feeling the solutions, they stopped being, I mean, there are lots of unions that are very prominent members of liberal circles, and they really support that. But then there's also a lot of students that are a little bit more moderate, or they support conservative candidates. And so there's more, there's a little bit more gray area than there was in the 60s. So I think that's really important, first of all, like to understand, so like there's, I mean, I think the technology has really impacted it as well, but I think that like labor unions themselves are weaker now. And that kind of has contributed, I think, more to kind of what they're doing. But then it's also like, well, of course, there's a lot of technological things, like social media, that people in organized labor and people that are in what has become like modern iterations of the civil rights movement have to contend with. And that can be a really powerful organizing tool, especially because there are fewer young people that identify as like really pious and religious. But on the other hand, it's social media in real life are different, right? So like getting someone or organizing people on social media can be a really useful tool, but also getting people to show up could be a lot harder. So I think that in some ways it might have exceeded their ability to actually make change in effective ways, but I think also it has given them reach to a wider audience. And I think that was like, well, again, like labor unions are what they used to be, and civil rights kind of transformed into kind of a number of different splinter movements. So yeah, does that kind of answer your question?
Yes. Did you hear that? She said yes.
Thank you.
Does anyone else have a question? Well, I have a question for Virginia. So, in regards to this work, right?
Yeah.
You're saying that it was publicized after her death. First question, how widely was it publicized? And secondly, were there any other women at all that seemed to publicly display the opinions that she did about society, about women's place in society during the Renaissance?
Well, publicized is not the word I would use. I would say published. I don't know if that's what you mean. You do mean publicized.
Well, yeah, kind of like talked about it in a public sphere in any kind of.
Sure. There is no information on whether or not this was discussed. No one really responded to it. So that remains unknown. I'm sure there may be, but that's definitely has yet to have been discovered. And the second part of your question was if there were any female figures of the time who mimicked her sentiments. Of that, I am uncertain because I was mainly just doing research on this particular, sort of like a case study. But I'm sure. And she at least had some sort of semblance, alliteration, some semblance of understanding of other women's opinions because she has so many contradicting opinions in the piece. So this must have been something that was discussed. If we do take if we do take this this book seriously, we know that women, their conversations were private and in secret, and that was a way to protect themselves. But at the same time, it's sort of a sad thing for historians and English majors because we don't really have any texts that were as publicly brash as this, and we don't really know. I mean, I don't know how it was received, and all of the readings, none of them really. Literally, there are like less than 5 works about this. It's super obscure, so that really has yet to be discovered.
Good answer, though.
Thank you.
Yeah. We've gone full circle, at least at that point. Can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
You lie, Sandra. Yes, we can hear you. Okay, cool. Does anybody else have any questions?
Oh, we have to have at least a couple questions.
Yeah.
It seems like the civil rights movement has really grown and succeeded in a way that the labor movement hasn't. That we're, in our current age, there's kind of universal acceptance in theory of the goals of the civil rights movement, and there's a lot of opposition to labor movements that are, people are trying to get them going again, as compared to the period of time you're talking about where they were more merged. Do you think that, what do you predict for the future?
Did you hear that?
Can you repeat that for me, Kayla?
So basically, she's just saying that the civil rights movement seems to have succeeded in a way that labor movements haven't in the United States. Why do you think that is, and what future do you see for the labor movement in the United States?
Oh, interesting. Why did labor succeed and civil rights didn't? Well, I think that part of it was a timing issue. So labor has been, labor started really seriously organizing in the decades prior to civil rights, the intense civil rights organizing. So they had their own kind of renaissance, right? And a lot of their initial, the things that they wanted were achieved. And so then it was kind of a mixture of other movements coming to the forefront in the 1960s, and then the changing political landscape that I think kind of made them recede a little bit. Whereas I think that civil rights came a little bit later, so they had their time in the spotlight, and they got their changes. There are some of the changes that they wanted, and then they also kind of they didn't receive. I think that it became a whole bunch of different movements, which I think is what did not happen to labor. So I think civil rights kind of adapted with what was going on at that time period, and it was easier for them to to change with the political landscape, because their goal was to change, was inherently to change the political landscape in the way that it did, right? Whereas organized labor was doing really well with the way that politics was organized in the 40s and 50s and beginning part of the 60s. And so when that changed, the foundation for labor kind of crumbled a little bit. And then also now we have different restrictions on labor. So unions can't mandate like that they pay membership fees anymore. And so then that, which is something that's happened very recently. And so then that kind of in and of itself makes it harder for them to function the way that they did like in the 30s and 40s when they were really, really big. So I think that like it was kind of a mixture of just when they both kind of flourished, and then also that the civil rights movement had the ability to change more, and they kind of anticipated that change. They wanted that change, whereas organized labor had a system that worked beforehand, and then it kind of went by the wayside when the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act and all the Great Society stuff happened. Did I answer your question?
Yes, thank you. If there are no more questions, then I think we're going to move on to the next segment of the conference. All right, thank you so much. Thank you, Rose. Thank you.